Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 71st episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all. At least something is great. I will say this. I have found a perfect distraction / distillation of seeing one's way through things because the local Alamo Drafthouse is doing its annual screening of the original Jackson trilogy, so it's like, sure. Take me away. and it is always interesting, as I have now for these past couple of years, seeing them again with a crowd in a theater and seeing what people respond to and remembering how crowds responded to certain moments back then and now. I won't go through all of them, but it's kind of remarkable who gets what applause moments where and how. It's kind of interesting, and also big laugh moments and things like that. And whenever Alerts gets his head chopped off, everyone's always very keyed up and very happy. So there's that. So we'll see how the next couple of weeks goes. Dwelling on the present moment, but we will. Yeah.
I am indulging in an adult beverage right now, in fact.
We don't blame anybody for doing
bourbon and cream soda, just FYI. Delicious.
Well, last night was a ginger beer with a little bit of actual gin, so you could say it's a double thing that way. It worked rather well. We won't ask what Jared's doing. It could be anything.
I was sitting here thinking, do I make a drug use joke? I don't know, because I don't do drugs, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to joke about doing it. I've got some cough syrup, just a liter of cough syrup with a straw.
Robo tripping, baby! Oh my God, take me back to 2004.
2004? Oh, yeah.
There was a guy in I did a journalism summer camp. It was the only time I ever did a summer camp. Yes, of course I did.
Wow.
At Northwestern, and one of the kids there with me, was a robo tripper, and hope he's doing well now. I have no idea. So
who knows?
No, I'm just high on life, baby.
Yeah. So
after this, I'm going to go down to the beach and look at some clams or something.
Wonderful.
Gooey duck fascination. You can't go wrong.
Yep.
So, all right. Well, we will continue on. There is a bit of news, so we'll just go ahead with that. So, Jared, please take it away.
Yeah, there's not much immediate news to share at the start of the year, and if only everything else in the world was so calm right now. But a couple of small things. First, who knows why the exact impulse, but the UK got some extra screenings of The War of the Rohirrim theatrically the other day with its Japanese voice cast instead. Not having seen it, we can't comment ourselves, but given the animating team and all, it might actually make some of it land a bit better in comparison. Then again, as we said in our previous episode, the whole thing was a bit of a head-scratcher. And meantime, the UK and Ireland got hit with a wallop in the past few days by a winter storm specifically named Éowyn. The Met Office, the chief government weather organization in the UK, has had a Name Our Storms effort going since 2015, apparently not wanting to miss out on the joys of naming hurricanes like we do over here. And a few years back, Arwen made the list to start a season. It's all down to chance as to if a name is attached to a particularly notable storm, and Éowyn was a big and destructive one by any measure across the two countries, including power outages, many fallen trees, and sadly at least one death. So we don't want to be glib about the situation or the naming, but it is another example of how much more widespread and understood Tolkien's creative world is in the current century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just, 30 years ago, if somehow that had come up on a list, they'd be like, what? Who? Now, there'd be some weird comment. Nowadays, it's sort of like, yeah, and all that. And not even the first one, as the story noted. So I was just, thinking about the mention, the fact that Arwen first didn't surprise me. I mean, I've known, given my age, some Arwens near my age because that were named by American readers back in the 60s, early 70s, started having kids. So that was like a first wave, but that was, fairly obscure. These days, so you get...
Well, that's why I didn't want to name my cat Lord of the Rings name, because I was like, everybody's naming their cats Éowyn or Arwen or whatever. So we will have to see. So, and of course, in terms of, fantasy lit coming through, even though, again, not subject to podcast, starting to be more and more noise about Greta Gerwig's Narnia movies. And I was thinking to myself, going well, Tilda Swinton
already played the White Witch. How are you gonna?
Yeah,
like that's the White Witch.
Yeah.
You know, I was half thinking you could get Kate to do it. I suppose it could work, but then part of me today was going like, well, wait a minute, why can't Tilda just do it again?
Yeah, just have her do it again. Also, Kate already did the White Witch, and it was called Tar. I love the movie Tar.
It's an excellent, excellent movie, and if you have a chance to ever see it on a screening with a really good sound system somewhere, boy, some of those moments will hit you. So we'll leave it at that.
I still haven't seen it. That's my shameful secret.
I do feel like it would be kind of your jam. Like,
yeah,
it feels like it would be. I do love an actress movie.
You'd love this. So no, that landed well. So, but more thoughts on this on social media and elsewhere, as I'm sure as time goes on. But there is stuff to talk about. It is the moment, and here we are. The choice of topic is Oriana's. Floor is yours.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I am imbibing, because everything is so bad. And I actually genuinely thought about winging this one just because, like, somewhat ironically, I have, of course, sunk into a pretty deep pit of despair this last week, which, as anyone who has experienced the feeling of despair before, it just makes it very difficult to accomplish a lot of tasks because, and listeners, you can't see, but I just kind of waved my arms at everything, which is, that kind of gets to why I picked this topic in the first place, because like we knew what was going to be happening. I don't think I'm a pretty pessimistic person, and the onslaught is a lot even for me. For anyone, a few days before we are recording this, or I guess earlier this week, America swore in a new president who, before he even took the oath of office, had started a campaign of terror against more than one minority group. And again, we knew this would happen, but it was strange to see how many people would kind of refuse to acknowledge this and are still refusing to acknowledge it in some ways, and thus despair. That's where I'm at right now. I know, like, this is not a politics podcast, but I do.
According to some people, it is.
Right. And like, you know what? Fine. If you guys don't want to listen, if people don't, that's fine. It's fine. But I do want to hold space.
Oh my God.
It's so funny how that's become a meme. I have a friend who works in the nonprofit world, and holding space has been a thing in there forever.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's funny.
No saying.
It's so weird to see it become this meme. Different world. So, okay, during this time, I personally have found solace in quite a few works of art, non-Tolkien wise. I'm talking TV series Chernobyl, the soundtrack for The Leftovers. Right, it's sort of, for me, it's all these people banding together to do what they can in the face of horror and disaster, even without often knowing the consequences. And, of course, we have Tolkien. The Lord of the Rings is not going to teach you how to overthrow a fascist government or really how to survive one. Like, that's not what the book is about. But, an author who suffered through trench warfare and the bombing of Britain naturally has a lot to say about despair and how to deal with it. A few choice little quotations to start us off. There is, of course, the line from Gandalf, which in the book is in the Council of Elrond, and it's somewhere else in the movies that off the top of my head, I want to say it's Gandalf talking to Pippin in the Siege of Minas Tirith. I don't know. Anyway, it's despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. And then we have Sam in The Return of the King in one of my favorite passages, and I think the Spouter Inn folks talked about this passage on their episode on Return of the King, so listen to that. It's a great episode. Listen to Ned's the bonus episode where Ned talks about Return of the King. The passage is this: "Far above the Etheldwath in the west, the night sky was still dim and pale. There, peeping among the cloud rack above a dark tor high up in the mountains, Sam saw a white star twinkle for a while. The beauty of it smote his heart as he looked up out of the forsaken land, and hope returned to him. For like a shaft, clear and cold, the thought pierced him that in the end the shadow was only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty forever beyond its reach." Which is really nice. Other couple examples, we'll talk a little more about this. Letter 195, Tolkien described himself as, quote, indeed a Roman Catholic, so that I do not expect, quote, history to be anything but a long defeat, though it contains, and in a legend may contain more clearly and movingly, some samples or glimpses of final victory. And I think, like, the entire concept of Middle-earth, of Arda itself, of the world that Tolkien built, is premised on fighting despair. The very matter of which it is made is tainted, and all will come to grief in the end, and this is the long defeat. But in the face of this knowledge, some people like Denethor allow themselves to be consumed by it. Others attempt impossible feats, like Beren stealing the Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth with Luthien, of course. And some people try to fight it off with jewelry. How are you guys fighting off the despair? Jared, are you... I feel like the jewelry part is like the most Jared.
That speaks to me where I am. No, Ned,
you can also jump in.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to...
No, let's talk about jewelry for the rest of it.
Yeah.
But, genuinely, I think part of what helped me get through the first Trump term, and part of what I hope will get me through this one, is, leaning more into my identity as, a queer person who doesn't always dress super masculine. Right now I'm wearing, a flannel shirt and jeans, so, not a great example, but, I don't know, just wearing gauzy jackets to the opera or whatever, being myself defiantly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that does mean a lot of costume jewelry.
Yeah.
So, but
well,
that's one way of coping.
Yeah, it's, in terms of what I've been doing, strategies in the moment for now, things like various tasks, relocating digital identities. I'm sure we can all think of examples. But also allowing that for new avenues to try new things. Within that, one other thing I've dedicated myself to is sort of having built up, having always had a personal library of many books and having been adding to them very heavily over these past few years. I'm like, I need to start reading a lot of these.
Yeah.
No time like the present. And I've been dedicating myself to doing a lot of that. I've already, just sort of most of the hunches of the books I did get turned out to be extremely good ones. So it's sort of this is great. So, and I will continue to do that as a way to, just sort of expand the palette that way and also find new ways to think about things, and one can go on. But maybe to turn it back a little towards the subject at hand. It's interesting how, both words are... both despair and hope, that is, are type of things that can almost be, if you're not careful, to not buzzwordy, not cliched, but the impact can be something that be less than it is. Having mentioned the Jackson movie adaptation, the line about hope that always kicks in with me is the one that's in The Two Towers, with the kid talking with Aragorn in Helm's Deep, there is always hope. It's right, there's that. Again, a made-for-movie moment adapting, not what actually happened, so not some there, but it finds its way in, and in that particular context, it found its way in a very Hollywood adjacent way. But if we turn back to the text, I think Oriana's framing and that excellent quote from Tolkien himself about how he viewed things, a certain, you could call it a built-in pessimism, and yet at the same time, while Tolkien was certainly, as we all saw, harken back to our letters episodes, he's very, very clear about these things. He is not I would not call him, and I never got a sense of him as and I don't use this word lightly, a depressive personality, but certainly he's somebody who was not unaware of how those feelings could be. And he would have been somebody who lived through, if we're talking about a major, major thing, he lived not through not one, but two world wars. The first, of course, that he served in, as we know, and had its long-term impact. And the second of which, even as he was, writing his, grandest achievement, as with anybody who was passed through that, and as was the case when he started working on the legendarium back in 1917 in the First War, we knew growing up as, learning history that, everything got through, quote unquote, conditionally. But at the time, he wouldn't have known that. Nobody knows until it happens. And that's always the thing. There's no way to know when something will finally let you go, in all cases. Or, you could theoretically have them. For instance, the American political system theoretically allows for that. But in other cases, it's more like, it ends when it ends. And I think this is something to sort of tease out, because the references, all of which are very good, especially the long defeat, but in other situations, you mentioned Baron, things like this. It's that idea that people do what they must. Mm-hmm. And it may be a little much to sort of foreground the hope thing before we talk about despair. Right. But this is also partially me. So before I get into more about hope, let's talk about despair, because I think one of the most striking externalizations, you could say, of that feeling in through legend, as Tolkien put it in that quote in Lord of the Rings, is the distinction among the soldiers of Minas Tirith during the siege, where it's the difference between when the Nazgul swoop over and then Gandalf comes through. And while Gandalf does provide a certain light and hope where he can be in the presence at the time, most of the rest of the time, it ain't there. And it's very much a case where, again, it's externalized. It's an impact that is heightened in the moment beyond just simply being a besieged person looking at a huge, vast horde coming forward. You've also got supernatural creatures. You've also got the supernatural effects going on. It is a heightened reality. It is not a situation that is exactly equivalent to, quote unquote, our world. And yet in doing that, in sort of like, pushing it forward, that's a real sense of like, you don't know if you're going to make it through the day. You don't know if you're all going to make it through the day. You're just sort of like, okay, you're going to do your best, but what is your best? And man, when those feelings prey on you, I think it's really vivid and is worth considering that in ways that hopefully don't, trigger anyone here or trigger anyone's listeners. But, this kind of darkness has to be addressed because it can come from so many sources, and Tolkien has a way of speaking about it.
Yeah, despair is the weapon of choice of the enemy in so many different ways. It is what the Nazgul inflict primarily. It's not there's only 9 of them. They aren't an army. But their impact is disproportionate because they inspire. Is there anyway? They spread despair. Denethor's undoing is his despair, which is because he, looks into the Palantir and Sauron takes advantage of that. We're still in relatively privileged positions. Certainly I am. Ice is not going to come knocking on my door. But it is helpful to remember during the onslaught, despair only serves the enemy. Despair only serves the people who want you to stop fighting and to not do anything. And that Tolkien understood very, very well. And in fact, thus we have these embodiments of that.
And I would throw in, too, that Tolkien has, in his own way, a very good nuanced sense of how despair and trauma intersect. And we can cast trauma very broadly, but here's a good example of something like that. I mean, I still remember when I first read the Silmarillion, after having read Lord of the Rings, as opposed to the Lord of the Rings, where things were dire, but such a the eucatastrophe, as Tolkien described it, the reversal of fortune, everything's great. Is that theoretically something like that happens with the Silmarillion? I guess. I mean, it's just like one reason clearly I think why the book never had as much of a take as Lord of the Rings has done, and has been more something that people just sort of like delve into and find out more if they really get into things further. Is that it can be so very, very grim, and there's no hand waving that. And one of the examples I think of how that works is I cannot remember the character's name. I was half thinking this earlier. Sure looked him up, but it's the band of men that Baron is this Baron, his father Barahir, and then the rest who are survivors in Dorthonion after that onslaught, and bandits in the woods just doing what they can, and the one who ends up betraying them is caught in by this phantom of his wife in the homestead.
I think is his name.
Yes, that's it. Yeah. And that whole thing, because it says so much without necessarily delving into it, because it's so plainly said, he went back and he thought memories, and just to have something, this idea of something that maybe she's there and maybe she's still alive, and then it's torn away from you, and then you end up doing the worst thing possible. I mean, that's a case where, Baron is the one who gets through it all and all that, but that minor but still notable sense of this wreckage left behind of a life ruined more than once. You put yourself in that shoes as someone's caught in that thing, and all you see around you is just nothing going. there is that. Fingolfin in the retelling of that battle Sully beforehand, he sees that when there's the white feet around him. Thus he rides out, he says, I'm going to do something, and he will challenge Morgoth.
Yeah.
He does so at the cost of his life, and he does, inflict injury on him and all that, but he immediately just sees like, it's all falling apart, and there's like,
and before him, Feanor does the same thing. Like, Feanor leads the host of the Noldor over to Middle Earth from Valinor, and he just, instead of pausing once they get to land on Middle Earth, he wants to press forward and press Morgoth, and he goes and he challenges Morgoth, and he also loses his life, and as he is dying and he gets carted away, but he sees the great fastness of Angband and goes, oh no, we can't, this is not gonna work, I did an oopsie, this is not gonna work.
Probably wondering how I got here.
Right? And so we see this kind of over and over again. But yet, Feanor sees this, and it doesn't really indicate that he articulates this to his sons. Surely they all know. They all know that this is totally hopeless, and yet they press on and continue to do what they can. And in the case of the Noldor, it's both good and awful.
Yeah.
But
which is such a masterstroke on to interrupt, but having them be fighting for the wrong thing, but also kind of the right thing, and is okay. Okay, yeah.
It is kind of an object lesson in a bigger tent, I don't agree with these Noldor. I think that they're bad and they've done some bad things, but oh my god, we gotta get rid of this guy. We gotta do something. We have to do something about this, which sometimes includes making common cause with people who have done some bad things, and it sucks.
And the sense about how the oath drives them to the oath cannot be overcome. And, it's interesting. I think it's interesting that Tolkien doesn't, to my mind, explicitly delve into any self-questioning from the sons of Feanor about, geez, who did this wrong. It's more sort of it's almost reactive. It's sort of comes down to the fact that, perhaps the ultimate example of that is after, Morgoth has been captured and the two Silmarils have been liberated, it still drives them. It itself is, it's partially, you could say it's just overweening, we swore it, we've got to. But part of that has to be just a weird kind of despair, because it's a despair in seeming victory. It's like we won, but, and, the end result is one kills himself and the other one just disappears somewhere, is out there, just simply a haunted figure, just, forever wandering the shores of Middle Earth. And, it's pretty grim, in either way, which way was better or best. I will say I always did wonder how Mithros just sort of found this crack in the world that he just sort of threw himself into while they were running around.
Well, convenient.
So, hey, there you go. Maybe he went looking for it. So,
I mean, I actually always loved that detail, just because the whole point is that the war was so devastating that Beleriand is destroyed. So of course there's a ton of these around. I'm sure.
Yeah.
I always thought that was so cool.
Yeah,
it's just there's one.
Yeah, no,
Off I
put
go.
it that way, you're absolutely right. To think a little bit more about it, not entirely. There is always hope, but maybe sort of bring up another thing about how despair can work. This ties back to one of our earliest, and I still think one of our best episodes, but also one of his best stories, and that is Aldarion and Arendis, the Mariner's Wife. Simply because that's a case where despair is something that it doesn't appear necessarily as despair. It isn't talked about in those terms, but it is a case where it's all the good intentions slowly but surely come to absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And it's not driven by an oath necessarily. I mean, unless you want out wedding vows, but it's more as that sort of two people who both want the best for their folks and what they have and what they see as the best thing for Numenor from their particularly relative privileged positions. One is obviously born to it, another marries into it, and what they see is what's going on. And the problem is that no matter how hard they try, their own particular viewpoints, and again, Tolkien never quite comes down on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Just sort of like, just sort of eventually grind it all into dust. And what is supposed to be a happy situation turns out to be just this, utter warfare. And so it's a way of a psychic warfare. And so it's a way of, despair in another sense, and despair in a very personal sense right here, how even in paradise, you can have that. And, there's no clear statement saying about how Arendis dies, but he, in a note, indicates the possibility is that she too ended up killing herself. She, by throwing herself into the ocean. So that's just one of those things that's sort of like, it's his willingness, Tolkien's willingness, I'd say, to talk about these things more than once. More than one character, that's how they die. We have, the most famous one is perhaps Denethor, fairly obviously. But you've got, we just talked about Mithros, so I mentioned Arendis. In the Silmarillion, Turin. Very obviously. I mean, that is ultimate despair. That is a no way out. This is it. This is my only thing to do. And, I'm not here to, and again, we mentioned triggers beforehand. We hope nobody is set off by that, but it is something to be aware of. And the fact that Tolkien was able to articulate it in a particular way, in a way that is both, compelling in a story sense, but actually does leave its own sense of quiet impact, is, I think, speaks to him. It's something that I don't think he necessarily would have dwelled there, but he didn't ignore it.
Right.
And I think that is kind of remarkable in the circumstances, really, from what I can tell of his character.
Yeah,
I think another...
Oh, go, Jared, go.
Please.
I've been sitting this entire time thinking about Saruman, actually.
Yes.
Okay,
Totally.
all right. Yeah,
Yes.
Go. Yeah, that's a good angle.
Because at first I was thinking, he kind of, he gives up, right? He's like, there's no point in fighting, might as well join it. But then I was like, he's kind of a tech baron. He's not so much giving up as it serves my purposes to join the enemy, and just kind of he does try to get Gandalf to give up. But I think the way that he weaponizes despair, when I think he himself doesn't share that, but he's just like, you know what, you might as well stop fighting, right? There's no point. It's very insidious. He's talking to the one person this isn't going to work on, really.
Yeah.
But people do that.
Yes, and
I see a lot of that. There's everything sucks now. Just
everything sucks, but also what?
There's no point in trying to improve it.
Yeah, and
what I'm going to make my own hay out of this.
Right. Yeah.
And also though, what
pretending
what
otherwise.
I don't know what. There's also what little you have, you could lose. For a lot of people, that's really potent. You do have this, if you own a home with a backyard or something, you are gonna, the prospect of jeopardizing any of that, you have a job and you pay for your mortgage and your kids, and if you have a lot of incentives to not fight.
Just fall in line.
Yeah, it's
there's something to that with the what the mouth of Sauron offers, if you will, because he's basically saying, "Hey, just let us rule you." And in the comment via the narrator is that they recognize that would just be basically his slaves and all that. But you look at the face of it, going no one will bear weapons. These things are here to tribute. There'll be a certain governor who's a little more trustworthy than Saruman and things like that. So, but men will have the leave to be free to have the leave their own affairs, or however the exact line is, things like that. It's and again, the temptation is there because you're sort of the end result is otherwise, look at us and look how powerful we are. And again, feeds into despair. And, that's more, it says something that's the way that Sauron, the arch, organizer has it phrased via the mouth, whereas Morgoth's no, it's a little different for me, and I will happily have you all dead, no matter what. So hunted to the very brink of extinction. Nothing survives, and almost nothing does until the very, very, very end. In his case, so and yeah, I mean, I think more can obviously be said, and things like this. But let's, and this is my nature, maybe coming to the fore. we can turn a bit now, I think, to talking in turn, with these examples of despair, and there are many other ones. It's notable too, I'll add, that in the shorter works, despair in that phrase doesn't really come up up. Farmer Giles is just too goofy. Smith, the Wooten Major, is more reflective rather than, so it's like this. Despair is in the legendarium.
Yeah.
Is essentially where it comes down to, and is it's there. So turning that around, where hope comes in, and where how hope can come in, and you quoted the famous examples. I think, of course, one great example is with Aragorn himself, who famously is named Estel.
Yeah,
and so it's like an incarnate version of it. Although very much not a Pollyannish "I'm here," but that's not his character. It's a classic case of doing that. And I do love how Gilraine is quoted in the appendices with the Linod, I think it's called, or whatever it is, the bit of poetry where it says, she gave hope to the world, but I've kept none for herself. That's a literalization and a classic good use of old poetic form in a very particular way. But maybe beyond that, and beyond what someone is supposed to signify, and again, thinking on his name, it's notable that the very last thing Aragorn theoretically hears before he passes is Arwen saying, Estel, hope in the end, right at the end, is it's sort of like this question of inner strength and looking to something, whatever it might be. And again, we've been talking about examples in the fiction here where everything seems like the worst scenarios possible, and yet how do people come through? And again, someone like Gandalf theoretically externalizes that as opposed to the Nazgul. But we have to look about when there's no Gandalf around, and the primary example of that, of course, is Frodo and Sam, as talked about. And I think it's interesting how to put it. We've talked about Sam, specifically in this episode, and the episode on him, and how he is the one who keeps things going to the very end. Even as he struggles with having where he finds his hope, but he still finds it. And Tolkien himself talked about how he was inspired by the characters of the Batman who served him and things like that, and the people he saw in the war, and sort of like you realize that there was something that provided a counterbalance to him. But beyond that, in that situation, I think it's just interesting because the situations are so dire that he is able to showcase Sam as someone who is able to respond to that in some fashion, in some ways, on his own level. He's not trying to. He grants Sam his own agency and his own words often in terms of where he finds his hope, which I think is very interesting. He could have just simply said, but Sam was hopeful. He doesn't. He does a little more. It's a little, maybe sort of an odd angle to unpack, but I think there's something there.
Well, I mean, just a brief aside, I do appreciate so much that at no point somebody is going, my grandmother used to tell me there's always light behind the dark, or whatever bullshit a certain fantasy series like to pull. I hate that kind of thing in literature or fantasy. Like, I know people tell each other things like, oh, cheer up, whatever. But the way it's done, where it's always this generic, like, my grandmother used to tell me, like, don't worry, the moon is always above the storm, or whatever. It's like, why do you all have the same grandmother? Shut up. This is making it worse for me. I am going further into this pit now. Anyway.
Screw your grandma.
Yeah. No, but I do, the point you're making, I do appreciate where Sam is like seeing the star himself. His grandmother didn't tell him shit about this star. He's seeing the star himself, and that makes it so much better when you have a character responding to the environment around them and finding encouragement there. A useful lesson for us all in some ways, even if we're not trapped in an industrial wasteland.
and I do think a lot about Merry and Pippin, speaking of Sauron, sitting amidst the flotsam and jetsam, the ruin of Isengard, just sitting there having kind of a nice time, smoking, eating. They found some excellent salted pork, Isengard is well provisioned, or Saruman at least is well provisioned. I'm gonna lean into the therapy speak here, that horrible clinical language that I honestly hate that has made its way into our vernacular. But self-care.
God, for a second I was so worried you'd say something like holding space, and I was ready to end of the recording right now. But also, but also, I mean, in that case, they've just won a victory.
Exactly. Yes.
But I'm also thinking of like Frodo or Sam specifically being like, you know what, we're going to have a nice stew.
Yes. Yes.
It might alert people to our presence. I'll be very careful, but we deserve.
We got to have this.
We deserve a nice rabbit stew.
And even a moment like when they're in Mordor, when they're still in the Morgai, and they come across the pool of like water that has somehow dripped down from a storm and things like this, and it's something that in no other case would they have ever gone for it, but it's something like, oh, it's here now, and we will take it. And that is something that, again, it is a question of hope. It does drive you forward. It's sort of like, okay, there's the mechanism to live, and it provides you a reason to live. It's like going like, okay, I'm not completely yet, not completely on that angle yet. Everything is against them at that point where they're at. They're hunted by, they know they're being hunted by orcs. They know Gollum is still alive. They're still not even anywhere near properly getting down to Gorgoroth itself to get over to Mount Doom, and yet there at least is that, and this idea that Sam, indomitable as he is in many different ways, even he approaches brinks, but then, you could say it's like, the storyteller provides a way out. Fine. I see it more almost like, that, and also Merry and Pippin, too, just to turn that back in. It's sort of like, there's something here, there is some sort of relief. There is some sort of thing that makes, life worth living in its own small way. It can be incredibly practical like that. It can
like
be as
making
simple.
a focaccia,
For instance, having an adult beverage.
Right.
That sort of thing. So what, let me sort of turn this around. We've been talking about things mostly on the level of our mortal characters, you can say, and all that.
But the elves, right? The elves,
yeah. We should talk more about that, because in some respects, their despair could be the most profound, precisely because they this is the way to be phrased. Is very cosmic, but there's something to it. Is that they're the ones who can tell men who sort of like fear death. It's like, yeah, but you get to go. And you get to go and leave, and the sense is that Eru is there for you, and we don't know what's happening to us. I mean, that's fair.
They're in their own Hotel California and then can check out.
Wow. Thank you for the image of a bard singing that now in Elvish.
Oh my god.
Great.
Okay, now I need someone, I'm sure someone has already done this actually, and did it years ago, but someone stitching together, Pippin or Bilbo saying the eagles are coming, and the dude, and the clip of the dude saying, I hate the fucking eagles, man. I need someone find it and send it to us, or make it and send it to us. Thank you in advance.
We'll have it linked in the show notes if we find it before it's released.
Fan.
Yeah. We love you out there. But yeah, I mean, it is something that when Galadriel speaks of the long defeat in that context, it's interesting how personal the stakes are, precisely because, they've seen so much. They know that for them, there is some sort of an end down the way, but even that end is incredibly murky. And it's one of those things going like, yeah, we get to be here forever. And this sort of is accentuated too by a book that grows more and more fascinating the more time has gone on, The Nature of Middle Earth, as we talked about, just because it delves into this sense of, elvish life and identity. And so it's sort of like, that for them, despair is not really articulated in a human sense, you could say. Everything we've been talking about has been, again, people for whom death comes comparatively very, very quickly, even if you're just, live a full human life. Whereas it's much different in their conception. I can't recall there's ever been in Tolkien, does an elf ever commit suicide?
I guess theoretically Maedhros.
Oh,
and Maedhros, I suppose.
Like theoretically,
okay,
that counts,
suicide,
right?
I think that's
but
suicide.
but
that's the only example
I
can think of, right? And
there's got to be others. Doesn't somebody fall on a No.
Does Nimloth do something? Or someone
Nimrodel does jump into the Amroth jumps into the ocean.
But
that's different.
Yeah,
He's trying to get back to shore.
Okay.
Yeah. It's almost like Maedhros is perhaps like, not to single out saying the only example, but it's interesting that I hadn't mentioned earlier too. It's already slipped my mind, but that is the only example of that, and precisely because that's such an uttermost extreme. Someone who has lost almost his entire family, who can't take any pleasure in the final victory, who only has that and basically realized that even that's not going to hold. It's sort of like, at that point, it's recognition, I literally have nothing, and I'm not going to hang around to find out more.
Yeah. And also, they don't utterly destroy themselves because they can't. which is this other kind of, like, they may, they first jumps into the chasm, and Muriel just chooses not to be rebodied, and we have these like weird examples of elves forsaking their physical bodies and choosing or being prevented from being reincarnated technically, but their spirits just can't leave, and so like this is just it's a very different, which I think it feels like the elves, like for them, not like despair, but the precursor to despair is almost a default state, because they know that the world is tainted. They have that knowledge, and they are of the world in a way that like even men are not. And yet they continue to try to keep it in this, or, to make it beautiful and keep it beautiful. Again, by means of jewelry, usually.
Yeah.
Jewelry.
I'm doing my part. The way that time passes for them, I feel like, makes them more susceptible to this kind of, like, there's that part where Legolas is trying to articulate, after they leave Lothlorien, he's talking about, like, no, we experience time as the elves do, where it's like, it's going by so quickly because you're so aware of the world changing around you, but it also seems to go on forever because you're going on forever. And that their overwhelming sense of like the ongoing destruction of the world is like and kind of a problem, and like I feel that, man. Like
and then also thinking about, again, after the victory in Lord of the Rings, we don't see it. It's one of the best, honestly is, I think, one of the striking off screen, you could call it, moments, mediums here in frankly in 20th century literature, where where Elrond and Arwen have their parting. We don't know what went down. We just know that it was very, very hard and bitter. And so whether or not you would call it despair or sadness or some of the things, it's something, the absoluteness of it is what completely is the key there, whatever it involves. And I also found it interesting in thinking about how after Galadriel leaves, and then eventually after the purse finally realizes that he needs to, sorry, Celeborn, you'll always be the purse. So is that, they talk about the utter remnant of who's there in Lorien, just a few, like, sad wanderers. So it's something that it seems more than melancholy. It just seems sort of like, it's a fine line. It's obviously not maybe despair as we've been talking about here, but it does give a sense of how even on the brighter side of things, everyone's sort of like, deep breath, we got through it all. They're like, no.
Actually.
Actually. So, and then perhaps bizarrely enough, well, the hobbits. I mean,
the most resilient, and that's why I relate to them so much. The resiliency.
And that's interesting too. I mean, as you rightly pointed out, Oriana, the book Lord of the Rings does not tell you how to resist a fascist government, but it sure gives a great example when one goes down at the very end. Please refer to our Scouring the Shire episode. But there is something there where there's a I don't want to call it that it's rollicking necessarily when it gets to that point, but there's a sense that sort of like, having gone through the big stuff and they're coming back and doing all this, they recognize the stakes are high and feelings are very bitter and sad, especially as they approach Hobbiton and they see all the destruction that's been done. For them, hope is at this point almost second nature. Is, it's not phrased in those terms. It's shown through action and sort of like, hey, let's get this going. People don't really like this. Come on, let's wake them up out of this. And and it happens. Wake up sheeple in a good sense.
Yeah. And in some ways, like, hope is not the antidote to despair. Action is. Yeah.
It's sort of like, it's an element, but it is not the sole thing. Something actually has to be done, and the idea that hope can take on many forms as a result. Some of it is actual physical action, much to Frodo's despair. He doesn't want anyone killed. Some die. That's something that he doesn't want, but occurs to it. But part of it is something as simple as Farmer Cotton just being at the fire there, just warming his hands, going like, oh yeah, when the ruffians all show up and all that. Just sort of this blithe humor, this sort of things like this. That in its own way shows a bit of hope too. You're sort of like, we got this, and all that. So, and he shows it in a way where he's not giving, there are no big speeches given about hope and things like that in that regard. It's more sort of like, well, yeah, just sort of like, and as you say, Oriana, the resiliency has a certain vividness in that context. It is something that it could be oversimplified if you're not careful. It's sort of like, these lovely children and all that of the world, but it is more sort of like this other way. Why were we doing this anyway? This was dumb. And once action comes through, everything pretty much goes fairly quickly after that.
The point, Oriana, about the antidote, the antithesis or antidote, or whatever. I can't remember
whatever I said. Whatever you said.
Whatever you said. Action rather than hope being the antidote or antithesis is, yeah. I mean, like I'm thinking of Frodo and Sam going up Mount Doom, and at that point they're like, we're not making it through this, but we have to do what we can, right? And they're not like, at that point I wouldn't even call, like, it's not even despair. They passed beyond that even to something. They're just like, this has to be done, and it sucks, but we're gonna keep going. And they do, and one of them gives up at the end, but they get as far as they can, which is like, I don't know, sometimes that's just what you gotta do, is just keep going.
And to
beyond despair.
And sort of further to my point about how, in the moment, Tolkien didn't know how either the big wars that he experienced one way or another would resolve. Frodo and Sam don't know they're going to be rescued by eagles.
Yeah,
that is something that is beyond their comprehension or imagining. That just is something. It's like they don't know Gandalf's alive.
It's just like, we're done. We did it. Yeah. We're gonna die here.
Yeah. So everything is still done for that. So it may be beyond hope, but yes, it is not beyond action, and that is something that's sort of like, in their minds, the only one they will have known that has actually done this thing will be themselves. There's no way to report on what will ever have done as they think about it, if they're even thinking about it that way, and they're not really. It's just more a matter of, here we are, and so is hope sublimated within action in that sense? Is it more a matter of just the hope is more a matter of, look, we just hope this will actually destroy Sauron, whatever that involves. And and I don't think even they ever articulate the idea of what does it mean to destroy Sauron. They just know that it's sort of like, it must be, or remove his power. What exactly does that mean? We read about the fall of Barad-dûr. We see the big shape up there. That wasn't necessarily, that Gandalf didn't say, like, here's how you'll know.
Right.
That's not how it is. You just sort of like, you have to react to events and interpret. And that's what everyone else is doing when they see everything going down, even as far away as Minas Tirith. They're like, it isn't until, like, an eagle comes over and goes like, hey, let me sing you a song.
No, this is good, actually. Yeah.
Don't worry, you're fine.
It's relax. So, well, we're moving towards the end of our usual time, so maybe some final thoughts. I mean, it's easy to be lost in some of the esoteric examples of it, of what Tolkien did across all his work when we're in what we're in and things like this. And again, we're not that kind of podcast, but if the idea is applicability, not allegory, to bring up that again, we'll link to that episode too. The idea is you find hope where you can. And again, this is partially me speaking from my personality, hard on the floor, things like this. I have generally been a natural, let's call it an optimist, but I've also been conditioned to be one in terms of how I've been raised and the fortunes and things I have in the society this is. Ergo, keep that in mind. But something like, again, where the applicability thing comes in is I go back again to something that I've spoken about more than once. And I did speak about this in the bonus Spatter In episode that I recently did. And I've spoken about it here before in the episode we did on Peter Jackson's Fellowship Half of the Ring, how in the interim between 9/11 and the release of the first time Fellowship of the Ring came out was when I was rereading it, and the sequence about pity and mercy and Gandalf and Frodo in discussion, and how that took on the new resonance for me. That's something that sort of clarified something that I hadn't fully appreciated before until I was in the historical moment I was in, and we were all just trying to muddle our own way through. And these are the type of things that people take these examples of it, both in terms of realizing sort of like, this is, a despairing character can be someone you can feel some sort of connection to. And the hope is still something to look for and try and find new ways through. Maybe, again, people are doing so, if you cannot trust a hope, or you just simply have to do what you can. I will end there.
And sometimes the eagles show up.
And sometimes they do.
So you don't know that they will, but they might.
So true.
Don't count on that. Keep going.
Going, but, maybe.
Keep continuing. And Oriana, do you want to close it out?
So Denethor is the Democrats. No, I'm kidding. I don't actually. This is my inner shit poster talking. But yes, so one thing that we didn't talk quite as much about, but is the importance of art in a time when despair is everywhere, including in one's own heart. Action is great, and making art, draw inspiration from wherever you can. But any kind of art you can make some jewelry. That's what the elves did. The elves did not. Write a novel. Write a screenplay that no one will ever just
make a film like you did.
Make a film. I don't know if I recommend that one, unless you have a bunch of money. More details to come on Sight Unseen. But yes, one way of transmuting your despair is to make art. Don't set yourself on fire and then run off a cliff. That was in the movie, but
whatever you do, don't do that.
Don't do that kind of thing. It doesn't. It's not good for anyone.
It doesn't help anyone.
It's not good for anyone, least of all you. And we'll be trying. We'll be trying, and we hope you will too.
Okay, the time has come to look ahead to the topic for the next episode. The choice of topic has come around to Jared. What are we talking about next time? Okay.
Well, I was going to make some joke about, we're going to talk about giving up. But no, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about somebody who didn't give up. We all know this person. We all love this person. We're going to talk about frickin' Lobelia Sackville Baggins.
Oh, yeah! Shit. That's awesome. That is great. What a wonderful choice.
Yes!
She is overdue for an hour of podcasting.
Queen.
There is so much to unpack with that. There are so many angles we can go in with that, and I am the English literature nerd in me is loving this already. So,
strap in, everybody.
This is going to be good. So I'm gonna have to do some brushing up on some relevant texts or something like that. So, this is good. Yeah, no, this is grand. I am looking forward to this. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Wonderful stuff. All right. And while I'm thinking of it, one extra news thing that escaped my mind, if you get a chance, do read from the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, the Overlooked obituary series, which gives proper farewells to people who weren't recognized as such at the time. Did an absolutely wonderful one for the incredible Karen Wynne Fonstad. Her Atlas of Middle-earth is, I mean, along with the Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth, those are, to my mind, the two essential key sort of addenda in terms of not created by Tolkien himself or prepared by Christopher Tolkien that you need to get around Middle-earth, you could say. The Complete Guide has arguably been taken over by being able to search things online, the Encyclopedia of Arda, etc., things like this. But you can't knock the Atlas. The Atlas of Middle-earth was, I still remember the first time I saw it shortly after I read Lord of the Rings, just a thunderbolt of, oh, wow, now I can really sense what everything is like. And the impacts have been so profound. It was great to see that. Check that out. Get to the Atlas if you haven't had a chance to read it. Mwah. So anyway, so we'll leave on that note. She did pass, sadly, almost 2 decades back, but recognition is long overdue. And with that, we'll say farewell for now to everyone. Thank you again for listening. We really appreciate it. Keep your heads up. And as always, you can find us megaphonic.fm/by-the-bywater. We are also available at By the Bywater on Blue Sky, so are the three of us individually, and various other social media spots around. And you can always email us at bythebywater@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening. We appreciate it very much, and we will talk to you next time. Until then.